which then leads us into, okay, so you have children who are deemed at risk. So what now? And we actually developed this before we developed the Sense screener. The numbers, so we had a 5-year project from the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development to develop a number sense intervention. And so it was an iterative approach. We did research with at-risk kindergartners from low-income communities or who perform poorly on a research-made screener. And then we did, once again, the interventions explicitly address number relations, and number operations. And we start with very small numbers. And so we tested the intervention in 4 randomized controlled trials. And after each iteration of the intervention, the lessons were revised based on the data collected in the previous year. So just as a very brief summary before I actually show you the final intervention. In the first year, what we did is we just looked at children. We had found that, you know, the low-income children were most at risk. So we examined those children and we compared them to business as usual controls. And then we also had a sample of low-income kindergartners where we not only compared them to a business as usual control, but we also used a language-based intervention as a control group. And that was like a language-based math intervention. The children did better on the very specific number sense intervention rather than the math literacy program. And then we also targeted children in year 3 with very low numeracy, regardless of income level, because we wanted to be able to catch all children. But this year, in year 3, we didn't find significant differences between the intervention and controls, all of whom had very, very low numeracy. And one thing that we found was by the time we got to the year 3, a lot of the teachers in the school were already there was sort of some effects. So they had seen the intervention, they saw that it worked, and by this time all children were getting more number sense interventions. But we did find that we had to revise and refine the intervention, really go back to kind of square one and like start with very small numbers and build up, which I'm going to show you. And therefore we came up with a very successful intervention for children who had extremely low number competencies in kindergarten. So our interventions have been published. We had what I was referring to in the previous slide was research studies, but then we developed it into a book called The Number Sense Interventions that's published by Brook Publishing. And basically, but you wouldn't have to use this intervention, but it more is, gives you specific ideas, but I'm going to talk about the general approach. And basically, it's systematic instruction during intervention to develop understanding of ideas about number, and then it intentionally builds knowledge of number relations, and number operations. And we do find teachers in the United States, anyways, really, regularly get emails from people who really, it's the most gratifying thing for me, who really like the interventions and want to know when there's going to be more, or that they're expanding in their school system and state. So basically, the number sense uses a group of practices to support number learning strategically. We've devised 24 lessons, but you can use some or all of them. And I know in an earlier presentation, I didn't get to hear most of them because I was having so many technical difficulties getting on. But I know people were talking about linear representations of number are so important to emphasize, the linear nature of counting numbers, as I discussed. We chose our vocabulary very carefully. And we used a lot of gesturing to highlight concepts and to provide another means of scaffolding development, like pointing to numbers while counting. We started with teaching the concepts of number relations, and operations with very small numbers. and then it was kind of circular. We then built onto larger numbers. We always provided corrective feedback and tried to give error-free practice to so children could become more fluent. And we do build in formative assessments with game-style activities, and we allow for children to move at slower or faster paces depending on their needs. Some children might need to repeat lessons, or some children could move more quickly through the lessons. So just examples of some strategies for number. We had them instantly recognize small quantities. We would go with finger use. I learned this from Karen Fusen, to trust the 5 for kids. Some kids, especially kids who are having trouble, they, when you ask them to show 5 fingers, they always start from 1, and they don't trust that if they hold up the 5, they don't have to count each one every time, but it helps them associate numerals with quantities. So then number comparisons, number partners, counting to solve addition and subtraction problems, and then word problems to deepen understanding. And Lynn talked a lot about word problems in her presentation, and this is just like getting kids into some very simple word problems early on. So I'm going to give you some specific activities that we did in lesson 1, and this is just a summary that the things that children would do in the lesson. And so I think then we can move on to, I'll show you some of the concepts that were included, or how we taught them. So okay. So this didn't come out really well on this slide because of the colors are similar, but just in terms of quantity connections, we had these subitizing dot cards, and we could play. They're very fun because children could do a lot of game-like activities with them, but basically in the dot cards, they just had to indicate really quickly how many dots there are. There's none, there's 1, there's 2. We're just starting with very low numbers to get them into not trying to count them all, but just automatic recognition. And again, remember, these kids in kindergarten, some of them are very, very low performing, and they kind of need this, kind of build these basic foundations. Then we also had kids subitized in 5 frames. So when we're dealing with just number 1 and number 2, they would see the numbers in a 5 frame, kind of similar to where you have 5 in your hand. And then they also would engage in showing 2 fingers, showing 1 finger, and so on. And then as the kids build in the lessons, they would move up to higher numerosity problems. With counting skills, we then got them into the number symbols and the number recognition cards. And then they would use unifix or interlocking cubes to make the numbers, to help them physically connect with the quantity. And then this is a cardinality chart that helps children compare magnitudes of number by visually underscoring the increasing magnitude principle. This chart, again, I learned about this from Karen Fusen, a math educator, that it's just an amazing resource because kids can really use this and see how the numbers increase as they move up, and you can see this clear linear representation. And here's an example of how we use the cardinality chart. So we would show them something like this, and then also have them then link the unifix cubes onto the different numerosities on the cardinality chart, which then would give them sort of this physical, concrete representation. In terms of number operations, we would do things like show them 2 dots, and then take the pencil. You can go ahead and separate them. And they liked that. It was just sort of this physical separation. Oh, one thing I wanted to mention, like we used a lot of black dots, and you might think, because we wanted to focus the children on number as opposed to lots of other things that might distract them in the environment. And you might think, oh, that's a little bit dull, but it's actually not. The children love the black dots. It's kind of, you know, we've seen this in numerous occasions that they enjoy playing with them. And then for number operations, we would really try to get them to connect. Okay, the 1 and 1 and the dots is the same as the algorithm. 1 and 1 is 2, or 2 take away 1 equals 1. And then we did devise some story problems too to put the number concepts into an everyday context. So then in terms of introducing more numbers, we did, the activities were structured that we introduced one new number at a time, and then we stopped at 5. And this is especially for very low performing children, so we tried to ensure a decent level of mastery before moving on, because they're learning these big concepts, but with really small numbers. And then we would move on to number 6 and above, and then they would have 5, and then they would count on 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And when you get above 5, then you start dealing with fingers on 2 hands. We do recommend that children do make use of their fingers because it's a representation that they have with them all the time. And there's something about physically counting the fingers that helps children. And one of our earlier studies showed that children who start on their fingers early get off their fingers early too. So it isn't that if you have children dealing with their fingers early on that they're going to be, long-term finger counters. And then we use different color cubes above 5 on the cardinality chart. We moved to 10 frames where kids were putting dots into the frames of 10 rather than 5. And then we do stop at 10 to ensure mastery with these types of activities, but then we do continue. We do in the number arena with counting. We do go beyond 10 because children are expected in kindergarten, at least in the United States, to count at least to 100. So this is just another example how we use the number list. We start with the number list rather than the number line because it's easier for children because you start counting at 1 rather than with 0, but then we do move into the number line. But so this is just an activity that we do with the number list where the kids have their dots. And they actually physically put them on and they count while they do it. And then this is just an example of a 10 frame where children have to think. And this is an example, yeah, I think that's all. And this is an example of, you can show the next one. This is a place value. So basically here they've been working with the 10s blocks. And so now they see 3 more. And so what they do is they put the 3 on there so they can see that it's 10 and 3 more, because we do feel like even in kindergarten with low performers, they can develop some basic knowledge of place value that helps them then moving forward in their math instruction. And then we use, for the counting and the n+1 rule, we use the hundreds chart if the child hesitates and doesn't know, because again, we want them to be able to get the right answers a lot, so they're not, just kind of guessing all the time. So if we say how much is 13 and 1, they can just look on the chart and see it's 14, or 13 minus 1 is 12, until they become very automatic with this. And then, of course, we work a lot on making connections with matching games. And so cards are laid out on the table, and children take turn matching number sentence cards to partner dots. So again, they see how all of those things are connected. We do engage the children in structured number combinations practice, which we found was very, for some kids was really, really helpful. The children that engaged in this did better than some of the children that, and in one study that didn't have this specific kind of practice. And we actually took some of the methods from Lynn Fuchs studies with number combinations. So the children respond right away to the number combinations, the simple ones, and they're presented in a game format, even just within 5. But if the child doesn't know an answer, we instructed them to solve the problem quickly on their fingers, using a method that we presented in the lessons. And we encouraged them to count on from a number if they could do that. And we encouraged them also to visualize quantities on their fingers to help them count. So if they couldn't respond right away, they could, they would engage in strategies that they were taught in our intervention. And then, there were questions about other. So that's kind of in a nutshell what our number sense interventions look like. There are 24 lessons, and again, you can get them through Brooks Publishing or writing me, and also writing me if you would like some of the PDFs for our new sense 3 grade level assessment screener. So anyways, but there were questions about what other resources there are, and the What Works Clearinghouse in the U.S. Department of Education is has very useful practice guides. This one is teaching math to young children that came out a few years ago. I was on this panel, and what they do is they take the research that's been done in an area and try to come up with specific recommendations for teachers. You can move on to the next. And so basically all the guides provide concrete how-to steps. You learn about the strength of evidence, and then of course some roadblocks for teaching children who are having difficulties. And so this was the one we came up with for the teaching math to young children practice guide. Now, I have to say moderate is actually pretty good, because that means there are a number of studies that show that teaching number and operations using a developmental progression, as I showed you with our number sense interventions. But the reason the others probably have minimal evidence, and we're recommending these because we think they're important, but they're minimal evidence because there isn't a lot of studies to show. There aren't a lot of studies to show that these recommendations actually work vis-a-vis, doing something like a randomized study. But there is some research to suggest that these areas are important. And then this is just an example, and you guys can get these slides, so I don't have to go through it all, but an example of how to teach number and operations that they recommend at a developmental progression. And I think that it really does fit very nicely with what we've done with the number sense interventions to help children deal with very small quantities and then move on to counting larger quantities, being able to compare quantities, label connections with number words, and then encouraging children to solve basic operation problems. And I wanted to say, I don't know if Lynn mentioned this because I didn't get a chance to hear her presentation, but Lynn is chairing this, and I'm on this panel as well, is to watch for the updated assisting struggling students with math intervention in the early grades. And it's a really great practice guide that has amazing recommendations. It was a wonderful panel to be on. So that should be coming out probably, I don't know, definitely within the next year. It's a great resource. And all of these What Works Clearinghouse guides, they're free. You can upload the PDF files at no cost at all. And you can also get a physical manual just by requesting that as well at no cost. So That's it. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your being here. I love talking to educators. It's the most gratifying part of my job, going from research to practice. And again, feel free to contact me if you have any questions, or once you look over the slides, if there's anything else that I need to clarify.